Yes, the session is live now. You can continue the session.
You disable the waiting room, sir.
Okay.
Shall I start, Rindam?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Very good afternoon to everybody for the third plenary of our webinar on translation studies across frontiers. Today, I am very happy to welcome and introduce Professor Kobus Marais from South Africa. India and South Africa are similar on several counts. The presence of several languages, communities, colonial and post-colonial experiences, etc., to name a few. Moreover, most of us in India, in my generation especially, grew up reading African literatures, novel, poetry, and other literary and non-literary texts. Hence, it's a great honor to welcome and briefly introduce Professor Kobus Marais. India and South Africa are Professor Kobus Marais is currently working as a professor at the Department of Linguistics and Language Practice, University of Free State, Bloemfontein, South Africa, and also nominated as the Vice President, Association for Translation Studies in Africa. He is a very well-known writer in translation studies, theoretician. He has published several monographs, Representation in Old Testament Narratives, 1998, Translation Theory and Development Studies, a Complexity Theory Approach. Okay, this is his specialization, in fact, Complexity Theory approach in 2014, and a Biosemiotic Theory of Translation, the Emergence of Social Cultural Reality in 2018, which Professor Michael Cronin has in fact cited in his lecture, in the first lecture that we had in this series. He has also published several co-edited volumes like Translation Studies Beyond Post-Colony, 2017, and Complexity Thinking, and some considerations and some methodological considerations in 2018. And his research interests include translation theory, complexity thinking, semiotics, biosemiotics, and development studies. He is the leading organizer of Summer School of Translation Studies in Africa, and also the founding member of the Association for Translation Studies in Africa, for Africa, and the founding editor of the journal for Translation Studies in Africa. He has been invited as a plenary speaker by reputed bodies of translation studies, including the NIDA School of Translation Studies, European Society for Translation Studies, International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies, etc. So I am with great pleasure, I invite and welcome Professor Kobus Marais to this plenary 3 of translation studies across frontiers. Now briefly, again, Professor Kundu will speak. Then I request Marais to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Padikal. As you know, translation, the very word denotes traversing beyond boundaries, traveling across borders. So this webinar that we have conceptualized together, we have taken Sujit Mukherjee's translation as discovery as a point of departure where translation opens up newer possibilities and alternative ways to read and study literature, which in Foucauldian discourse can undermine established canons. So this webinar series is actually trying to draw together, exchange ideas, and develop newer theories and models of translation studies for further research. I am happy to welcome Professor Kobus Marais, who is working on the field of alternative translation. And I'm sure that today's talk will open up and will try to dismantle this universal notion of translation from the Western perspective, and will also try to chart newer territories, okay, beyond the margins. So I welcome Professor Kobus Marais. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues from India, Professor Kundu, Professor Parikal. Congratulations with this initiative. I think you are taking the lead and showing us a lot of leadership. So congratulations. And in particular, thanks for the kind invitation. I explained to the two professors that I actually intended about 10 years ago to visit India. I was in contact with Professor Trivedi at that point, but things never worked out that way. So this is at least a virtual visit, my first to India. So thanks for this. Also to colleagues from all over the world, thank you for taking the time to listen to what I'm going to try to explain to you. So in the work that I've done up to now, I've tried to reconceptualize translation broader than mere language. So I tried to conceptualize translation within a semiotic theory and provide a semiotic conceptualization of translation. And that actually led me in the 2019 book to start thinking about thermodynamics and to begin conceptualizing some of the implications of thermodynamics. So what I'm trying to talk to you about today is a continuation of that work, but focusing specifically and working out the thermodynamic implications of translation. So I am situating my work and the thinking in a debate that is taking place between the natural, social sciences and humanities, trying to solve, I think, two major problems in thinking. The first problem is, how can physical things have non-physical consequences? So if you think about the atoms in the ink on a printed page, in a letter that says, I'm coming home for the weekend, how does the atoms in the ink and the ink on the printed page and the page, all the material things, how do they create something that is immaterial with you? And that is an expectation or something that you are waiting for or something that you are looking forward to. So this is a really deep question, but that lies in the link between natural and humanities scholars. The second question is the reverse of the first one. How can non-physical things have physical consequences? So think about an idea in your head like social justice. And then the social justice in some way becomes enacted in your body. It becomes institutionalized in certain laws. It may even become prevalent in the architecture of a building or in city planning. So these two questions, I think, are the sort of the big questions that lie behind the kind of thinking that I'm trying to work out. Now, this problem, as you would probably all know, has been a very long-standing problem, well, at least in Western academia. It's been since the Greek philosophers, the prehistoric Greek philosophers, the Platos and the Aristotles. It's been in the Middle Ages, and it's been in modernity. It's a real current problem, which had a number of solutions, but none of which are really satisfactory. So there are basically, over history, they developed 4 approaches to solving this problem. The first approach is dualism, which basically says that, well, reality consists of 2 separate substances, mind and matter, or body and mind, and they basically have nothing to do with one another. They, in a vague sense, they're linked, but Descartes sort of suggested that they're 2 separate realities, as it were. Then you have physicalism, which is prevalent, obviously, in the natural sciences, which says, well, reality is pure physics. Everything else is just an epiphenomenon. It seems like real, but it's not really real. It just seems like it. Then we have idealism, and that is the opposite of physicalism, where physicalism says the only reality is physical. Idealism says the only reality is our ideas and what we know about the world. So we cannot get outside of our ideas, a line of thinking that was popularized by Kant. The fourth suggested solution was what is called neutral monism, which says that reality is actually one substance only, but it's neither physical nor mental. The physicality and the mentality are just aspects or perspectives on reality, and reality can then be something like God or justice or something like that. So what is the alternative? Over the past century or so, emergentism or complexity thinking has emerged as an alternative to say, well, there is more than 2 things in reality, as in dualism. There's also more to reality than reducing everything to either matter or ideas. And let's see if we cannot explain how new organizational features in systems emerge, and how more complex systems emerge from simpler ones. This trend has been particularly strong in the natural sciences, and I think it requires a response from the humanities, which is what I am trying to suggest here. So in the natural sciences, you would find books like Stuart Kaufman's At Home in the Universe or Reinventing the Sacred, providing a physics and biological underpinning of where ideas and mind and intentionality came from. In Karen Barat's study, she uses quantum physics to basically try the same thing. Davies has an collected volume in which they try to explore the role of information and how information links nature and culture, or mind and matter, whichever way you want to look at it. And then obviously, I think probably the most important book in this line of thought, and on which I base a lot of my own thinking, is Deacon's Incomplete Nature. So they all try to explain, where does meaning or significance or intention or relevance come from, by asking, how does it come about that physical systems which do not have these features come at some point to exhibit these properties, right? So there was a time in reality when there was no life. And somehow out of the physical material substrate that there was life emerged. And then there was a time where there was no sentience or intelligent life, and then that emerged. And so the question is, how did this come about? So the scholars from the natural sciences have actually done quite a bit of work on this, but the problem is that their answers are actually still the answers of physics, chemistry, and biology. And the question then remains for the humanities, and I will show the link with translation studies later, that given physics, chemistry, biology, how would the humanities see a unified approach to matter, energy, and ideas, or what is absent? Remember, ideas themselves are based in matter, like in a brain, but the idea itself is not material. It is something that is absent. It might even be a goal that the organism strives for. So what are the implications for the humanities of these suggestions by natural sciences concerning a unified field? I think the question then is, how should we respond? We should probably think about what are the advantages of this kind of thinking, if any. I don't want to already suggest that there are advantages. I think this should emerge as time goes on. But I think the place to start is to try and determine which questions we should ask. So how do we even approach this problem, and where do we start with it? And what do we need to ask, and what do we need to know to be able to answer the question? We have some idea now about how mind emerged from matter. But the question is, can we explain the reverse? Can we explain how mind causes changes in matter energy? At this point, I think humanities scholars just assume that this happens. So they assume that the ideas that we have, what comes from our minds, the intentions we have, these things change reality. But the question is, can we explain exactly how it happens? For instance, we can explain the interpretation of a text, bracketing out the ink on the paper. But what would it mean if we not bracket that out? And to be honest, I don't know. In sociology, for instance, we can statistically explain trends in a society. But can we explain in terms that are consistent with physics where ideas come from and how they cause social change? In the humanities, idealism, which is one of the four responses that I suggested, has become really popular through social constructivism, but and there's much to say for it. Let me grant that, especially for social constructivism. But the problem is that it leads to a dualist position in humanities, where humanities scholars would often argue that nature or matter is the problem. Those of you who would work in feminist studies would quite often hear calls to debiologize feature X or feature Y. And that is a real problem, because if we have to debiologize, if we have to denounce our biology to be fully human, then we're actually cutting off ourselves. So the dominance of idealism, I think, is a problem, and I think we need to try to look deeper into this matter. So my questions would be, could we create a way of maintaining both matter or matter energy and what this matter energy is about in one approach? Where do we start is the question, and I would like to suggest that I think we should start at information. I think that information gives us a handle on both the physical and the ideational. And I will explain in the rest of the paper why, or the talk, why I think so. So Gregory Bateson gave this really sharp definition of information. He said information is a difference that makes a difference. So information is a difference, is a material energy system that makes a difference. In other words, that has meaning, that has value, that has usefulness, that is about something, right? So in this line of thinking, Bateson joins the material and the ideational in one conceptualization. But before we can go to information, I think it's important that we should start one step lower, and that is with thermodynamics. So I think it is generally accepted these days that reality is both matter and energy. So in quantum physics terms, both particles and waves. And that we not any longer think of matter only as substance or as particle, but and this means then that as we include energy in the equation, we now have to start thinking differently about reality. It means that we have to think of reality in what Marais calls terms of sedimentation. In other words, both substance and flow, or substance and gradient, or substance and tendency. So how do things come to be? It's like the sedimentation process of soil. There's a process through which energy takes material, substantial form, if I can call it that, right? So if we want to talk about information, we need to talk about energy, and that means that we need to talk about the second law of thermodynamics. So this second law of thermodynamics deals with the issues and the states, and deals with this issue and states that reality has a tendency towards entropy. In other words, it says that if we leave reality to its own devices, it will go nowhere. It will die down. It will stabilize. Everything will become in equilibrium. It will take a long time, but it will still happen.
Sorry, Professor Marais, are you sharing the screen? Are you sharing the PPT?
I hope so.
No. The PPT, you have to share the screen.
I'm so sorry. You should have. Can you now see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry, I just want to get it on the slideshow. Sorry about that. I do apologize. I thought I was showing it. So let me just, okay, so this was basically what I was. So if we start thinking about what is energy, I think it's important to note that energy is not a substance. It is not something that is inside some matter, but it is a relationship between two different physical states. It is only when you can think about difference in physical states that you can think about energy, because energy is a relational concept. So in popular terms, we can say there is energy when two physical states are at different levels of entropy. So if the entropy or the disorder in the one state is higher than in the other state, then this difference can be harnessed for work, and then we can say there is energy. So just imagine if you have a bathtub, you've plugged it, you've put in 50 liters of water. While this water is in the bathtub, it could potentially do work, but it won't do work because it's in equilibrium, right? It flattens out, it's of the same height and level. This pressure is the same everywhere. So it cannot do work because it's in equilibrium. But if you pull the plug, the difference of the water pressure on the inside the bath and in the plug, in the exit pipe, allows the water to flow. So now there's energy. Now there's work that can be done. So for instance, you could put a little turbine in your exit pipe in theory, you could do that to provide energy for your cell phone, for instance. Obviously, I think it's going to be so little it won't work, but this is just in theory. But the point is that when we think about energy, we should not think about something that is in something. We should think of a difference in the entropy, in the chaos, in two different physical states. And this becomes really important for information as well. So I would like, as I suggested, to explore whether information itself could be a common ground in this effort to try to link physics and ideas. So we know now that the whole of reality is subject to thermodynamics. Physics is, chemistry is, biology is. Obviously, somehow our ideas, which is what I mean by humanities, our ideas and our thoughts and our intentions are also, but the question is how. So let us then look at information and see if we can find some answer towards this kind of question. So like energy, information is not something, it's not a substance. So there is no information inside a text. There's no information inside any physical system. But information is the relationship between two physical states or two physical systems. So linking back to Bateson, information is there something physical that tells us something non-physical about something else physical that is present. So you can see information entangles, as it were, the physical and the ideational. So rephrasing Bateson briefly, information is therefore a physical difference that makes a difference. Now, when Deacon explores this, he distinguishes between three aspects of information, namely syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. I think those of you who work in linguistics and in translation studies should know this difference. But how does this play out? And it plays out in the following way. So the famous engineer, Claude Shannon, in the 1940s and 50s, worked out an engineering answer to the syntax problem of information. So Shannon basically wanted to study the capacity of the medium from an engineering perspective, because he worked for a communications company. And he wanted to see how much information can you send through a particular medium? What is the carrying potential? And the answer one of the answers that he suggested was that if you can constrain the entropy in the medium, so you provide the information with form, you constrain the chaos in the information that you put into communication, that will reduce uncertainty in the receiver. So the better you constrain at the input level, the more you reduce uncertainty in the receiver level. So basically, the less entropy, the more information, was what Shannon suggested. So Shannon gave us the syntax, in other words, how to structure information for it to reduce uncertainty in the receiver. However, the physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, actually before Shannon, suggested a theory of thermodynamics which Deacon uses to talk about referential information or semantics. So the question is, Shannon has now told us that physical systems can carry information. But the question with information is always, what is the information about? And Shannon didn't deal with that because he was an engineer. It wasn't necessary for him to deal with that. But for us in humanities, we need to know, how do physical states refer? How is it possible that they refer? Now here is Deacon's argument, which I find really intriguing. It says, normally, a physical state should be in a state of maximum entropy, right? So think about the bath water again. The temperature of the water in the bath, if you leave it for long enough, should be at the same temperature than the air outside the bath, or the temperature of the bath itself, right? So normally, when you perceive a physical state, it should be in a state of entropy, in a state of chaos, in a state of equilibrium. If it is not, like if the water in the bath is hot, then it means work has been done to bring this physical state, the water in the bath, into an improbable state. Because the probability is that whenever you find a physical state, it would be entropic. If it's not entropic, it means it's in an improbable state. And that can only have happened if work was done to heat the water, for instance. So somebody had to pour in hot water, somebody had to light a fire under the bath, whatever. And the important thing is that this work has to come from outside of the system. So a closed physical system like bath water cannot heat itself. The work has to come from outside. So, and here is sort of the crucial point. The physical state inside the system is as a consequence of the physical state outside of the system. And this means that the relationship of the physics outside of the system and the physics inside of the system can tell us something about what caused the change, right? So in this sense, a physical change in a system was caused by external causes and is therefore causally about that external cause. So because it has been caused, because the internal change has been caused by external changes, this internal change refers to or is about the external change. So if you reduce the physical entropy in a system, that itself produces the potential for reference. And the point is here, the potential. We will talk about the actual reference or the actual significance in the meaning in a moment. But the point I think Deacon tries to make is that we can, in terms of pure physics, describe how one physical state is about another physical state, which gives us a solution to the problem of reference in terms of information theory. I forgot to say at the when I started talking about Shannon, for shorthand, Deacon talks about Shannon information, Boltzmann information, and Darwin information, which is probably not technically correct, but it's just sort of shorthand. So Shannon told us that physical matter energy can carry information. Boltzmann told us how it comes to be that physical differences between two systems are referential. The question now is, what does it mean? What is the significance of this reference? And this is where Deacon talks about Darwin information, because he has a long argument, which I don't want to go into detail now, about how evolutionary selection selects particular information. But the point is that Shannon and Boltzmann information creates the potential for information. But that potential is actualized only when the information is interpreted or translated. The question is, how does interpretation comes about? Because now we have another problem trying to explain where significance comes from. For Deacon, the fact that with the onset of life or the emergence of life, the interactions in proteins caused as an effect a membrane, or which we know these days as a skin, to follow or to enclose this physical process, that created an inside and an outside for an open system, right? So a living organism is an open system. It needs to get energy from its environment. It needs to excrete waste products. So the membrane both separates the organism from the environment, and it connects it to the environment. So the inside obviously is self-organizing, and it's doing work to counter the second law so that it doesn't die, so that it doesn't go into chaos or into equilibrium. But this means that the inside is coupled with the outside for energy or for information in order to survive. The organism in itself cannot survive. It needs to be coupled with an outside system to get energy to do the work that it needs to do, not to die, and to get information, which we have already seen is linked to energy. So this coupling through evolution is preserved inside the working of the system. So what then is significance? Significance means that the physical states or the changes in the environment is now relevant to the survival of the organism within the membrane. So what happens outside the membrane is relevant to the survival of what goes on inside the membrane. So the organism needs to respond to its environment in order to survive. Stuart Kaufman said that any organism has two basic responses. It's either yum, I can eat it, or yuck, I can't, it's bad. John Deely said there are three approaches that any organism can take. And that is an approach to, or that is a choice to approach something. It's food, I can go towards it. I need to avoid it because I'm food for it, or I can ignore it. It's not relevant to my survival. So in this way, the interest of the organism, the self that emerged inside the membrane, implies that this self inside the membrane needs to interpret the physical changes in the environment, which is the reference, in order to change its behavior or to maintain its behavior, or to do things that it has to do, like search for food, etc. So, sorry, I just want to conclude this. So what we now have is we have in Shannon information, we have the carrying capacity of a physical medium. In BOLTZMANN information, we have the reference made possible by differences in two physical systems. And with Darwin information, we have the pragmatics or the significance of the previous two for the living organism. So it means that information is always carried physically, but the information is not in the physicality. The information is in the constraints on the physicality that conveys the possibility of information. And the information is the relationship between physical states that are external and internal to the organism. And so this is on the one hand, the physical states inside and outside the organism on the one hand, and therefore the interest of the organism. So interpretation is therefore always the process of selecting which of the physical features that was presented to me as information in Shannon information and BOLTZMANN information, which ones of these are relevant to consider. And that's what interpretation is. Which of these are relevant for my by my, I mean the organism's self survival. Which physicals are relevant? Because some might be relevant and some may not be relevant. And that is what the interpretation process is. And this links up to what we know about hermeneutics, Gadamer's horizon of expectation. So I will consider these physical constraints in relation to what I already know, in relation to my own survival. And if you thought that was it, now I think the trouble begins. Because we have here an idea as to how meaning emerged from matter. So how did it come about that stuff can be about something? So we have an idea about the bottom-up emergence of meaning from matter. But many questions remain, and I want to focus on only one. And this is the second question that I started out with, is how can relevance or aboutness or absence or interest or significance have effects on matter and energy? So here is one possible solution. You can give us the physics of information, which I've now repeatedly said, and I'm going to run through this quickly. We have Shannon information, the potential of the medium, Boltzmann information, the reference embodied in the physical differences, and Darwin information is the determining the relevance. So what Deacon gave us is pretty much the following, and I've related to you in a diagram. So Shannon information or potential information, physical constraints or Boltzmann information, and significant information or relevance. And you will see in a moment why I put it in this form. To answer our question of how physics and semiosis or physics and ideas relate to one another, I'm now turning to Charles Peirce very briefly to explain his phenomenology. So Peirce was interested in how reality appears in our experience. And he says it always appears in three categories. A category of firstness, which is just potential meaning, potential relevance. So firstness is just, I become aware of a sound without knowing what I'm aware of. I'm just knowing that I'm aware. Secondness for Peirce is the becoming aware of what you are aware of. So secondness is reference, or secondness is, in his terms, also reaction. So to be able to differentiate between the first awareness and what you are aware of, there has to be some reaction and some kind of difference that you should be able to observe. And then thirdness for him is the way in which you link up firstness and secondness in a habit or in a generalization or in not a law, but a regularity, if I can call it that. But Peirce took that semiosis, took the phenomenology and gave us a semiosis based on the phenomenology. So he said when the way in which meaning is created is that we have the first, which is the representament. That is the sign vehicle. That's a physical material thing that we observe. We have the object, that is what the sign stands for, what it refers to. And then we have the interpretant, which is the meaning of these, of the whole sign process. The important thing is that you cannot take these three things apart. A sign is not the sign vehicle. A sign is the relationship between the representament, object, and interpretant as determined by further semiotic processes. So if we now combine Peirce and Deacon, then I think we have something like the physics of phenomenology or the physics of semiosis. Because the representament or the first is also the carrying possibility of the medium. So the first, or the representative, is the Shannon information. The second, or the reference, is the BOLTZMANN information. So the object tells us something about the reference based on particular constraints. And then we have at the bottom the interpretant, which is determining the relevance, as I suggested in Darwin information. So I am close to being done. I just want to maybe consider a few implications. So I think what we have now, at least in theory, is a conceptual model with which to superimpose the physics and the semiosis or phenomenology of information in a unified theory. In this conceptualization, physics and semiosis are entangled. And I don't mean entangled here in a metaphoric way. I mean it's physically really entangled. And organism and environment are coupled in a coupled system, a combined system. So the question is, what weaves together the physics and the semiosis? Once again, if we go to Peirce, Peirce said that the meaning of a sign is its translation into another sign. So the meaning of a physical difference is its translation into another physical difference. If I can go back to Shannon and BOLTZMANN. So translation is that, I think, which relates physics and phenomenology or semiosis into an entangled or a coupled or a woven web. We can see how through a process of translation, materialities become ideational, become relevant, become of significance. And this happens in a process of translation. I'm sorry about this. It's somebody calling on Skype. So what happens in a sign is that the sign operates by irreducibly relating a first to a second to a third. And we can now see how the first and the information carrying potential of the medium is linked to the second, or the reference of the physical difference, by means of a third, which is the significance or the relevance of the interest of the organism. So I think it's a unified theory in that the knower, the known, and the knowledge are entangled. And they are woven together both in existence and in experience. So it's both ontologically and epistemologically, I think, reality, experienced reality is one woven web. It allows us to study the physics and the phenomenology together through translation. I am working on some empirical work that I would like to suggest, that I would like to present at some point in further publications, but it's still early stages, so I thought it best not to try that out today. So also, I think the implications of this line of thinking is that it entails an argument against the idea of embodiment. And if you have read embodiment studies and how people use it, especially in translation studies, it's quite often not about embodiment, but just about the idea of embodiment. So this argument that I've presented here, I think, should be in favor of real embodiment, of encologiment, of materialment, and of energyment, where we really bring together matter and mind in one system. And I think, as Professor Cronin rightly suggested, that because we now have this unified concept of the differences that make a difference in reality, we can have a unified view of our relationship to reality. In other words, how matter and mind fit together. And we could have some kind of ecological view, develop some kind of ecological view of how these fit together. I'm closing with a major question that remains. We should now be able to explain how, rather than assume that, the mental, ideal, virtual in reality, in other words, the significance, the relevance, the value, the interest, have causal effects on matter and on physical things and on the question remains, how? Frankly, I do not know. But I suspect that cognitive sciences and ecological sciences will suggest some answers to help us explain how the interest and the relevance that emerge from living physical systems feed back into those systems from which they emerged. And the answer, I suspect at this point, would probably lie somewhere within a biocognitive semiotic ecology, if I can coin a horrible word like that. Thank you very much. That is what I wanted to share with you. Obviously, this is work in progress, and some of my ideas on this is still a bit raw. So if you were to engage with me, it would help. And I think we could collaborate all towards clarifying some of these things and even point me in the right direction if I'm wrong. Thank you very much. Back to you, Professor Kundu, I assume.
Yeah, hello, Professor Kobus. For a fantastic talk. I was completely mesmerized. I was actually taking notes. I have asked all our participants to post their questions on the chat box, and I'm getting some of the questions. Can I quickly take two? Professor Abdullah Aziz, he has asked you that what are the possible avenues through which local or cultural context affect the thermodynamics of meaning or interpretation and perception and transmission of reality?
That, I think, is exactly what I don't know yet. Somehow, what we need to do now is to start thinking about the way in which ideas have become sedimented, if I can put it that way, into cultural practices, into cultural programs, into institutions, into social structure, whatever that means, and to see how these constraints upon constraints upon constraints now become further constraints for further meaning making. This is, I think, the big question where we sort of assume that this happened, but we cannot explain it in terms that are consistent with thermodynamics and information theory. And yes, I just, at this point, I don't know, apart from having some hunches, like we probably would start with the cognitive sciences to see how ideas become, through the brain, become embodied in the limbic or the muscular system, and how that plays out into reality. The crucial thing here for what I'm trying to suggest, and I have a medical doctor colleague who constantly reminds me of this, is that in this process, we will always have to keep the physical real, if I can put it this way. Otherwise, it becomes just another humanities way of thinking where we cut out the physics. So we will need to find ways to include the manipulation of physical systems into our humanities thinking, and I don't know how yet.
Thank you. The next question that I got from Professor Yetian, he's saying that, the talk gives me an impression that translation should not be treated as merely a discipline, but rather a specific kind of philosophy. is it possible to develop a philosophy of translation studies or even philosophy of translatology?
That is, I think, a really great question. I've listened to an interview about 5 years back that was done with Umberto Eco before he passed away. And one of the questions that was posed to Eco is whether semiotics is a discipline. And he said he doesn't think that semiotics is a discipline. I think he called it something like a broad approach or something. I can't remember the details of, but I know he was quite clear about the fact that he thinks it's not a discipline. So I start with that to try to say that if what I have suggested here, if that holds, then you are right. Then translation studies should not be a discipline, but it should be, yes, probably, I don't know whether a philosophy or an approach or a way of actually linking together a whole lot of things. Because remember, we know from interlingual translation that translation has this linking capacity, not an innocent one, but it has this capacity. So if you can expand that and say, yes, translation could become something that links physics and biology and law and religion, theology, religious studies, etc. Then yes, I would agree. I have in a paper that is to be published in Punctum, the Semiotics Journal, in the next few weeks, I've tried to argue that Persian semiotics doubles as a phenomenology of translation, which somebody like the Canadian scholar, the Canadian philosopher scholar, translation studies scholar, now I can't remember his name, but we've been talking about this a lot, and he's actually, as far as I know, trying to work exactly on a philosophy of translation. So yes, I think you are right. There are many philosophical implications and meta-disciplinary implications of the kind of thinking that goes on here.
One thing I think, Professor Marais, I think this question is also about how we can connect, this discipline of philosophy with translation. And your project on this alternative translation, I think this question that Yetian posed, I think is very important, how other disciplines can affect on translation studies. I really like the question. I will definitely send, I have your call for paper that you sent to me, that, that alternative translation, I'll send that call for paper to Yetian. Okay, next.
Thanks.
Next, okay, Professor Chinmay Dhadukar asked you that how is untranslatability understood in this biocognitive semiotic ecology framework?
Oh, that's a great question. In my view, there is no untranslatability. In my view, the whole argument around untranslatability rests in a Platonic assumption about meaning as a substance inside a text, if I can put it that way, or an immutable inside a text. I haven't read all the literature on untranslatability, so I might be wrong, but the fact that meaning is created in a process means that the process can just continue forever. So basically, I think there is no untranslatability. Everything can be translated. If you are asking if all meanings can be copied exactly, well, that was never possible in the first place, because meaning is the translation of one sign into another sign. So if I ask you what anything means, you can only link it further to further signs. So if a text was created, if any meaning was created like that in the first place, it means that that the process can continue forever. So I think that the untranslatability debate rests on faulty metaphysical, philosophical assumptions, and probably related to Saussurian semiotics. But that's a story for another day.
Okay. Professor Mridul C. Mrinal, he has asked that you talked about the selection of elements which is relevant in the interpretation. Doesn't the survival of the fittest ideology is often result in leftover of some ideas that treated as non-relevant? Isn't it this non-relevant information in interpretation often become the most discussed topic latter because of its ignorance?
Wow. I'm not sure that I understand the full impact of that question. So let me try to respond from what I understand. So firstly, I think we need to distinguish between the selection of genetic material through the evolutionary process, which is a physical biological process, and an informational process. So that's one process that happens where information is actually through selection preserved in the physical body and in the biological body. What I had in mind when I spoke about the selection of relevant physical states is the significance of the physical changes that needs to be interpreted. So let's say I am a living organism. I observe a fire. That is a physical system that makes a difference. The light comes into my retinas, it goes into my brain, all these kinds of things. Now, how do I determine? So okay, let me rephrase the example. So I see both a cloud of smoke and I see a rain cloud, right? They are both physical systems that that I need to interpret. So the question in interpretation becomes, which of these two physical systems are relevant to my survival? And that's what I meant by an organism. Human beings are always surrounded by numerous sets of physical systems and physical changes that require their attention and that require their interpretation, that refers either to the danger or threats or food or shelter or whatever. So what I was trying to say here is just the process of interpretation is always, it's never a one-to-one physical thing. It's a choice between the relevant structures. So maybe in a given occasion, I should run away from the cloud of fire because it could burn me, and run towards the cloud of rain because it can kill the fire. In other occasions, I might want to run towards the cloud of fire because I'm hungry, and the cloud of rain might hold some hail or electric storms or whatever. So the point is that the physical differences do not interpret themselves. It is the self of the biological system, of the living organism that needs to interpret that. But if I can somehow get that question in writing, Professor Kundu, then I might be able to give a better response, because I also couldn't hear very clearly exactly what the question was about.
Okay, I will send you that question. Okay, another that I received from Professor Soumya Sajan. First of all, she wholeheartedly thanked you for talking on phenomenology of translation. And she wants you to clarify the process of translation that is observed phenomenologically from the physical states of matter and energy. If so, do you consider thought and consciousness related to it? How do you consider time in this context? Is there a time which is instrumental or referential, or there is nothing as time? What is your opinion?
Well, the first question, or the first part of the question is, I think in the closing slide, I tried to hint that exactly issues like thought, consciousness, cognition would be a way of, we need to look there, yes, definitely. Because, so Peirce gave us an account of how semiosis works, and he said that all thought is in semiosis, right? So thought and semiosis are linked, are linked together. The problem with Peirce was that the value of Peirce is also the problem of Peirce, and that is that his thinking was so abstract that we continuously need to fill in some empirical detail into that. And that's what I'm hopefully slowly trying to do. So yes, thought, consciousness. I also know that in the neurosciences, there are lots of debates about how consciousness emerges and all these kinds of things. So those obviously have to be taken into account. In cognitive sciences, the embodied mind idea, the extended mind hypothesis, all these kinds of things need to be brought in. But I think they need to be coupled with some kind of ecological thinking that provides us with a bit of a bigger picture. The second part of the question was, I'm sorry, I've lost it now. The second part was?
So do you consider thought and consciousness related to it? How do you consider time in this context? Is there a time which is instrumental or referential, or there is nothing as time?
Well, I wouldn't want to venture into some deep explanation of time because I'm not a physicist, and I think my understanding of it is really limited. What I do know is that thermodynamics always relates to time. It entails time because in purely Newtonian physics, time doesn't matter. Whether you see a process moving one way or being reversed, it's the same rules apply, and processes can in terms of that physics can just be reversed. While in thermodynamics, they call it the arrow of time. So in thermodynamics, or thermodynamics mean that time is relevant and that time cannot be reversed exactly. That's why you can't get a back translation of a translation. Just in terms of the thermodynamics, I mean, you can do it, but it won't be the same. You can't reverse the process. So in that sense, yes, time is essential in this process. I probably am not qualified to answer the rest of that question, which seems to me have maybe deep philosophical assumptions, which I don't think I can answer. if the person once again wants to engage me in a discussion later on, I don't think I have a good answer to that second part. It's a really good question, and I just don't know at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Marais. I think Soumya Sajan is hearing us. Professor Sarah Mariam asks that, how can you explain relevance of cognitive environment and communication?
Well, what I have suggested here explain to us how we get ideas, where ideas and intentions and significance come from. Obviously, when you have a number of organisms, which are physical systems, the other organisms themselves become part of the environment, right? So it is not only the pure physics of the environment that is relevant, but the moment you have societies, social features, the other organisms also become relevant. Now, exactly how to explain that in terms of thermodynamics and information theory, I'm not sure yet. That's one of the things on my to-do list. But obviously, the communication, the interaction between them becomes part of the constraining physical differences that make a difference. So if somebody else shouts in my ear, it's a physical difference that makes a difference. If somebody else sends me an email, it's a physical difference that makes a difference. So obviously it's relevant, and obviously the cognitive environment, it sort of gets a life of its own. But once again, I'm not yet clear how to explain that in terms of thermodynamics. And I think that's the big questions that how does this symbolic world, Yuri Lotman spoke about the symbolic universe, how does this have downward causation on other constituents of the symbolic universe and on physicality? And I'm convinced that it's relevant. I cannot yet explain to you how.
Okay, next question. There is no name written. The question is, can you throw some light on the relation between Darwinian evolution and thermodynamics? In terms of translation.
So okay, so let me once again make hedge my answer. I'm not a physicist and I'm not a theoretical biologist, so my knowledge of these topics are secondhand. The relevance to my argument is that Deacon made in various of his writings made an argument that the Darwinian process of selection is actually a process of preserving information. So in a particular species or line, the evolutionary process is a process of preserving information, and then not just physical information, but information that is relevant to the survival of the living organism, right? So that is how Deacon argues that this preservation of information in the genetic system, which is then worked out in the biological system, in the proteins and so on, through the microtranslation process, is an information process that's based on relevance and on significance. I don't think I have a full theoretical biological answer to the question, but for me, that's the relevance of evolution to the argument that I wanted to make.
Okay, let me just check on the chat. Okay, another question that I got, what is the future of thermodynamics in translation studies?
The future of power dynamics.
In translation studies. What are the new possibilities, I think,
Yeah, okay. To be honest, I haven't thought about that. I've just started thinking about this. So I think one of the major implications would be to link this work to the work of somebody like Manuel de Landa. And there seems to be a growing kind of new materialism in the humanities and in sociology, which links power not only to disembodied ideas, but to embodied ideas, but also institutionalized ideas and materialized ideas. So I think, for instance, although probably Latour and de Landa would not see eye to eye, their efforts at linking the material to the ideational is where we should look. And somehow I think we assume power in the humanities without ever proving it. And we say, this has power and that has power, and this powerful person did that and that powerful person did that. And so I would like to see studies where we engage with physicality to make arguments about power. That's as far as I've thought about this. Thanks for a really good question.
Okay, thank you, Professor Marais. I thank you for accepting our invitation. I thank you for engaging with such a new concepts of translation studies and bringing an interdisciplinary perspective into it. I am sure that this talk will open up many new avenues of research in translation studies and inspire young scholars across the world who are listening to you to think of translation studies from newer point of views. Thank you, Professor Marais. On behalf of Professor Parikkal, I think there is a network issue from his side. I can't see right now. So I thank on behalf of the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, and Faculty of Arts, Communication and Indic Studies, Sri Sri University. I thank all my colleagues for being there with me. I thank all my students. I thank all the participants for joining us today. I hope that, Professor Marais, we can send you an invitation next year to visit India for the first time. And I hope that you will enjoy our greener campus. And I thank you all my participants once again. Please join us for the next talk. Till then, take care. Thank you, Professor Marais.
Thank you very much, everybody. Keep well. Thanks for the opportunity. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.